Hi guys. So today's video is going to be a list of reasons why I decided to go down the self-publishing route rather than the traditionally publishing route. There are a fair amount of misconceptions about both options, and there's definitely a ton of work involved regardless of which option an author chooses to go with, but I personally decided to go with self-publishing because the main reason being the freedom that comes with it. I'm not going to do a side-by-side comparison of both of them. I have an older video where I do that if you're interested in hearing that, but I will give some context so that my decision and anybody that's also in this position where they're having to decide makes a little more sense. First, for most people who want to traditionally publish, they have to get an agent. Querying an agent is generally what it's called when you're trying to seek an agent out and have them represent you, and it can be very, very overwhelming. It can be very time consuming and very stressful for a lot of authors. Once they get an agent, for most people that's so exciting, but that does not mean that they have a guaranteed book deal, because then the agent has to work on their behalf to try to get them signed with a publishing house. This process can take years, and beyond that, agents and publishing houses are going to sign the people that they think will make them money. So even if you have the best story idea in the world and it's clear through your querying that you are a talented individual and that your story is very good and well written, even if all of that is true, if at the time that you're trying to get your book published, it just doesn't seem like the right time for it to sell and it doesn't come across as, oh, this is going to make me money for the agent and the publishing house, you could miss it. There's a reason, of course, that when Stephenie Meyer wrote the Twilight books and they blew up, all of a sudden there were so many other vampire stories. And that's true nowadays, I think, of fairy tale retellings. I think that's true of fairy and fae stories. But when somebody has to query an agent, the way it works is you don't send them your entire book. Agents do not have the time to read your entire book to see just how original your story is. They get sent, you send them a little thing summarizing the book. You let them know what your qualifications are. That's kind of the gist of a query letter. And then you send them a sample, and that sample is a couple of pages. And while I have a lot of faith in agents and publishing companies in finding really good material out there and finding really awesome and unique stories, I just don't like the idea of having to wait and put in all this effort to convince somebody that my book is worth telling based off of a couple of pages of it, when in the end, after all the work I've put into it, they're gonna make money off of me. If you know absolutely nothing about how payments usually work in the publishing industry, just a quick little gist of it is that the agent will make 15%, and then the publishing house pays the author an advance. So let's say they pay you a $10,000 advance. Then when the book starts to sell, you don't actually get any royalties until that advance has been met. So really the publishing house is making that money back, and then they continue to make money after that, and then you get a very small percentage of the royalties. So that's what I mean when I say I don't necessarily like the idea of working really hard to have those people tell me, yes, your story is worth selling, only to have them make money off of me. There are, of course, reasons why a lot of authors still choose to do the traditionally publishing route, even though I'm making it sound kind of like a bad thing. A lot of times if it's a series, you're going to get money after that. You are going to get royalties, and then once you've kind of got your foot in the door, you're more likely to get other book ideas signed. A lot of people also feel that the traditionally publishing route just has so much more prestige to it, that people take books more seriously if it's got one of the publishing houses stamped on it somewhere. I absolutely agree with that, actually. Even though I'm choosing to self-publish, I think that the self-published community of authors out there, unfortunately, a lot of their works are saturated with not the best content. It is incredibly easy now to self-publish a book. It's not incredibly easy to be a successful self-published author, but it's very easy to get your book printed out in some kind of form and say, hey, look, I wrote a book. Because of this, it is unfortunate, but I do think that right now there are better books in the traditionally published realm. Doesn't mean they're all fantastic, but your chances of picking up a really awful book that's being sold in a bookstore are generally lesser than if you picked up a book in the same genre that's self-published. And I hate saying that, but that's just my opinion, and it's just what I think. Despite this, I still think the pros for self-publishing outweigh the cons. When it comes to some of the other things that I really want in the book, That's also where I'm getting at when I say I like the freedom that comes with self-publishing. For example, I like having a say in what the cover looks like. Although I think it's getting better, it's really embarrassing to walk down the aisle of adult fantasy in a bookstore and see how many covers have scantily clad women whose chests are just like smashed up and together, and they're holding a sword or bow and arrow, and they have no practical armor on, and you're like, what is that? And I just hate the idea of working so hard on a book. I mean, heck, I know we're not supposed to judge books by their covers, but I judge those books hard. But yeah, I just hate the idea of working so incredibly hard on a fantastic story and amazing character development and a cool magic system and all the things that make a great fantasy book, only to have somebody else have a bigger say in what gets plastered on the cover and displayed in bookstores. And that's a quite extreme example, but there are other covers that they could be beautiful, but if it's not what I want, it's not what I want, and it's my book. And maybe that sounds selfish, but I hate the idea that somebody else gets to tell me no and gets to tell me like, we know what's best for what will make money, because I'm not out to make a ton of money. I'm out to tell a good story. Going along with that, many of you know that there's going to be my character art in the book. There is going to be monster art that my monster artist did, and there's going to be a lot of extras at the beginning of every chapter. There's just a lot of other really fun elements that I wanted to include in the first edition. I think there are beautiful 10th anniversary editions out there, or there are really cool special editions that come out, but I wanted the first edition of my book to be pretty much its best. That's not to say that maybe someday there won't be a really cool, awesome edition of the book that comes out, but I want the first edition to be awesome. I want it to be amazing. I wanted to include all of those extra cool little details that I, as a reader, really enjoy seeing in books. I know a lot of you really enjoy seeing them in books. And while I'm very aware that this is something that is going to cost a little extra because it's more to print and it means extra pages, I'm okay with that. But I don't like that somebody else that's higher up wouldn't be okay with that, and they would get to decide that for me. Basically, I'm a control freak. There are also just elements within the book that have to do with the writing and the storytelling that I'm not a particularly big fan of. For instance, sometimes publishing houses will tell new authors to make the first book in what they're hoping will be a series. Sometimes they will tell them, hey, can you make the first book and a little bit more in a complete fashion, so that way if your book doesn't do so well, we can just sell it as a standalone. This is why sometimes you will read a book that you think is fantastic and you'll wonder, wait, is there a sequel? I mean, it felt pretty wrapped up, but is there going to be another one? And you won't find out for a while, and that's because everybody else in the publishing company is waiting to see how well the book does before they sign for sure the rest of the books in the series. And sometimes, worst case scenario, the books don't make the publishing house as much money as they were hoping, and what they'll do sometimes is they will hold on to that person's contract, so they're not allowed legally to release their book. They're not allowed to release it on their own. They're not allowed to release it through another publishing company, and they have to wait. The author has to wait until they get the rights back to those books to then sell them on their own or try to sign with another publishing company. And sometimes they're really successful, and other times the publishing house completely ruins their career. Some people think that this does not happen very often. They think that this is just some kind of outlier problem that most people don't face. But here's a tweet from V.E. Schwab, who most people have heard about if they're fans of fantasy, and it says, "I wish publishing would stop overpaying untested debuts, thus condemning most to a series of harsh reality checks and punishing the majority who couldn't live up to their inflated and unrealistic expectations." I certainly don't want to deter anybody who wants to have their books traditionally published. I think it's a huge accomplishment, and there's so many barriers that people who traditionally publish have to cross over and get through in order to have their book published, that for the most part, usually their books are pretty darn good. Maybe not always to everybody's liking, but you know that they're going to have gone through things that ultimately produce a good product. For me, it really came down to the amount of freedom that I have to do what I want with my book, to put in what I want with the content, and to deliver it in the way in which I want to deliver it. It of course helps that I have all of you have been so supportive throughout this whole process. I have so appreciated all of the kind things that you all have to say. I love your enthusiasm and your excitement for the book, so of course, as always, a huge thank you to all of you. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.